Phil Hartman was the first, and maybe only, celebrity whose news of their death hit me pretty hard. His regular presence on my TV during the part of my life when I know my sense of humor was developing made him indelible. Between The Simpsons, News Radio, and the spots in The Critic, just the tenor of Hartman's voice would bring a smile to my face. Still does. But it was on Saturday Night Live that Hartman really soared for me. He made every skit that he was in 10 times better just by showing up on camera. This is the kind of person SNL's producer, Lorne Michaels, has always tried to stock his cast with, so the audience would get that weekly dose of witty social commentary the show has long provided. And it was this level of talent that made for a great talking point for me and my guest Tony at Biddeford, Maine's Banded Brewing in mid-February. Take a listen to part one of our conversation. Recorded live from Biddeford, it's sometime on Tuesday! Well, I'm here at Bandit Brewing in Biddeford, Maine, and I've had a great day so far talking with people about everything from the Ben Casey theme song to Pizza Hut in the 1980s and 90s and Terminator 2, and it seems to be kind of hovering around, with the exception of that Ben Casey one, hovering around the late 80s, early 90s. And so I have Tony here, and we're going to talk about Saturday Night Live in the Phil Hartman era. That one of the golden ages of the show. Now, the show itself is a product of the 70s. You know, the original SNL lineup and the whole concept of it was from the 70s. But by the time you get to a decade later, we're talking 88, 89, early 90s, what role or status had SNL become in your life and maybe across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I just remember from a really early age watching Saturday Night Live, and I think the earliest I remember is like Eddie Murphy days and like when it was really big. That was the 80s,
yeah.
There were times over the years where it kind of the cast, you know, was like, oh, SNL is dying, it's never gonna, you know, it's not gonna survive. And now we're what, 48 years, I think. You know, you're talking about the Phil Hartman years. Phil Hartman, you know, Dana Carvey, Martin Short, that whole thing, and it was just such a great cast, and you always knew you were going to get a good show. And, I mean, I stayed up before we had DVRs. Right. You know, I would stay up late on a Saturday night. My mom was very understanding. When I was a young age, she knew I loved the show, which she did too. It was just such an iconic part of that time, and it was a lot of like. You know, even though I wasn't in the workforce at the time, like water cooler discussion on Mondays.
I've seen lots of interviews with SNL alum, and you know, they said that the city of New York was always their biggest gauge. Like the next day, you know, because that's something that they make a point of. And Phil Hartman had some of the best, you know, like live from New York openings. Like he could do that, like look at the camera and say live from New York on Saturday night, so well. But that was a New York show.
Yeah.
And they said on Sunday, you know, the next day, as they're going around, and then obviously on Monday, they would get their feedback immediately. And it seemed like the New York audience was the one that matters most. Like, yeah, that skit about, you know, whatever, that sucked. You know, don't do that again. Okay, we won't do that. A lot of work went into every, you know, it was a live show, so they had to get ready like Monday morning. They'd get their guest star, and they would start writing their skits, and they would have to do rehearsals by Friday, and it was a whole big thing. And yet we were there, so I remember same kind of thing. I would ask permission to stay up maybe on this every now and then, and my parents seemed to be always okay with that because that was the era of like really high quality skits.
Absolutely.
You know, what were some of the recurring characters and skits that you liked the most in that era?
Oh man, I mean, so now we're talking late 80s, early 90s. Was when I was in high school and then college. I mean, I got out of college in 92, so, you know, I remember I used to do an imitation. So Martin Short did this great character, Nathan P. Thurm, and then he did Ed Grimley.
Yep.
Ed Grimley was the guy who loved Pat Sajak. I used to do an imitation of him, and my mom used to crack her up every time. But, you know, Martin Short had just a bunch of great characters. And I loved when they would do, and this is probably more in the 80s, they would do the fake, like, documentaries or like the 60 Minutes piece.
Yeah.
You know, we're investigating this, and think I'm probably going back a little further with Chris Guest and Martin Short were the Olympic synchronized swimmers.
Oh yes, yeah.
But they were brothers, and Martin Short's character had a nose plug and a cap and like floaties on his arms or a life vest or something. But Martin Short had a lot. But Phil Hartman, I just remember, because we were talking about him earlier, he could do almost anything.
Yeah.
He would do Bill Clinton. He would do these throwback, like, 40s or 50s actors.
Caveman lawyer. Like,
yes.
Even
oh, my God. That was great.
His weakest characters were so funny.
Yeah.
If anybody else played him but him, it wouldn't have been as good. But he had that, just like the tone of his voice, like the way the inflections and stuff. He was always at the top of the game. That's how our conversation started before our recording, was that when he died, I remember like getting into the car. It was after baseball practice or something. And my mom, it was on the radio, and she was like, "Oh yeah, Phil Hartman was killed." And I was like, I remember actually, I was like the first and maybe one of the only celebrity deaths that I was like, like that could kind of hurt. Cause I'm like, And I remember that was because he lent his voice to The Simpsons all the time in that era, the same time period. And I'm like, The Simpsons really went downhill as soon as he died, because they didn't have that Lionel Hutz, Troy McClure to turn to. So he always added such nice, like, it was like you said, he was able to like call back those mid-century demeanor and voices so well, and he added that to the show, which The Simpsons relied heavily on that kind of humor.
Yep.
It was such a big loss. And then of course SNL, like that was, his. It was like his playground. That age was like him just being able to do whatever he wanted.
I mean, that was a great run when he was there. He had that cast. Short, Phil Hartman, Chris Farley was another one that, they just, it was funny because they had, I think it was not too long after that kind of run with those cast members and others like Chris Rock. Then it kind of got stagnant for a while.
Yeah.
They had some some really good cast members, but it just was like, but I tell you one thing that I still to this day I think the best part of the show is Weekend Update.
Yes.
And
Kevin Nealon in that era.
Yeah,
too. Dennis Miller.
He was great. Dennis Miller with his very caustic, sarcastic wit. And nowadays, like, we're talking now, current is Michael Che and Colin Jost. Those guys are great.
Yeah.
And they're not in any other part of the show, but they're writers. But that was, to me, it was always a highlight, because you knew when you saw the musical guest, you knew when they came back from commercial, it was always going to be Weekend Update. So, if I was kind of like nodding off before the DVR days, I'd have to like force myself to stay awake because Weekend Update was going to come on.
That's such a great way of putting it, because that was like, the show has changed a lot, and I think a lot of that is response to the YouTube. They do a lot less of the actual live stuff. It seems like every episode now has a sketch or something that they filmed separately and then just air it on Saturday night. But the pattern of the show, by the late 80s, early 90s, because they didn't have that originally. They had like stand-up comedians early on, and they didn't get their footing until that time.
Right.
So much so that they had the same kind of pattern every week. It's like you said, okay, the first time the musical act comes on, what's, commercial break, Weekend Update's going to show up, and it's going to be hilarious. So even when Norm Macdonald took over that job, he was doing that.
I loved him too.
90s too, because he was all about OJ stuff. He doubled down on OJ with that. But you're right. I feel like late 90s, early 2000s, they lost a few of those key members of the crew, of the cast, and they seem to go too much into recurring characters. Like the cheerleaders that, what was his name?
Will Ferrell.
Yeah, Will Ferrell and
Sherry O'Terry.
Sherry O'Terry would do it. It's like, on occasion this would be funny, but every week, come on.
You can't, you water it down a little bit when you do it too much, I think.
Molly Shannon's Mary Catherine Gallagher thing every week. It almost became too scheduled by that point, where it's like in the age of Toonces the Cat. Remember those skits? And I was actually just talking earlier with somebody else about Terminator 2. I remember the episode with the woman who played Sarah Connor, Linda Hamilton, was the guest star, and they did, of course, Terminator-related stuff, and Phil Hartman played the Terminator in the Toonses
never
skit.
saw that one.
And
Wow.
he's running along, says like, "Go faster."
Yeah.
He did the voice perfectly, and it was like Toonses is a Terminator cat, and they keep going off the cliff with Toonses the cat, and I'm like, it had just enough, I don't want to say danger, but like unpredictability in that age. Like they could come up with, because those minds were involved. 'Cause that's something else about Saturday Night Live a lot of people don't recognize, is that you have writers, but a lot of times the writers are also the players.
Right, exactly.
And so they are coming up with all sorts of stuff, just in a week's time. And on Saturday night you get to see, like, okay, present it to me, what do you got? And in that age, it really could come from anywhere. They had it really any direction. So what does that say about American society at large in that late 80s, early 90s, that they could pull from a lot of different areas and it was still hilarious? What does that tell you about that era in history for the country?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I mean, and I don't know if I'm going to answer this correctly, but I just think they did and always have done a good job of just using what's going on in the real world, the news, and taking that and spinning it and making it funny.
Right.
When sometimes maybe it wasn't, or, I mean, American presidents have always been punching bags for Saturday Night Live, and they doesn't matter if it's red, blue, you're gonna take your hits. Some take more than others, but I just think they've just always done a good job of just, seeing what's the real news,
right,
and let's use that. Not just like Weekend Update does a great job of that, but I think they do it in some of the regular skits as well. And they just always kind of had a good. There were maybe times in the history of the show where they weren't so good at that, but mostly I think they had a good job of having their finger on the pulse of, like, okay, I think this could be funny if we did this.
Right.
One of my favorite skits of all time was, and I can't remember what year it was, but it was Alec Baldwin. It was a Christmas one, and it was like a national broadcasting, show, and so you can see them, the two NPR, National Public Radio, the two women that are the hosts, and there's Alec Baldwin, and so you can see it, visualize, but you picture listening to it on the radio, and it was Pete Schweddy.
Yep.
And his company has this Schweddy Balls.
Yes,
and
I remember that one.
All the stuff they said in that, and they were dead serious. The delivery, they never went out of character.
That tends to be my favorite, and I know I'm not alone in this, but my favorite kind of humor is when it's like this close to reality.
Yes.
It's like paper thin.
Yeah.
And I remember that one specifically because it sounded, if you close your eyes, you're like, I'm listening to NPR right now.
Right. Because they
it's-
did the voices perfectly.
Yeah. That like where they were like, all right, well, we got it. Very like deep, and just like very monotone, and that one does. Yeah. That was.
Yeah. But I think that was one of the things they could do is say, okay, something that an average person like you and I, they would just take something, or one of their writers, and go, you know what, we can make this funny, and and I would say, I don't know if that's funny, and then you see the skit and go, oh my God, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
To me, that's one of my all-time favorite skits of all, just because of it's loaded with innuendo.
Right.
The guy is legitimately talking about his family that makes Christmas treats and Christmas balls and all these other things, and it was great. And a lot of times they would have skits like that you would go, I would never have thought that would be funny, but it was the way that they kind of looking at it from a different angle and making it funny.
I feel like Saturday Night Live definitely by that point had almost created that kind of comedian, that, and I know I put down Molly Shannon before for the Mary Catherine Gallagher thing that she did, but because she was in that skit.
Yes, she was one of the.
She was one, and I remember seeing her on Conan one time, and Conan was a writer for SNL before he became.
That's right.
Late night guy, and he worked for The Simpsons too, and he was asking her one time, like, oh, what other characters have you kind of toyed with? And I remember her saying something like, oh, like those women or those girls are always cold, and she started doing like this, like no matter what, like they always need a sweater, and I'm like, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
because we all know somebody like that, you know,
Exactly.
and all she had to do is that slight little impression, and so I feel like because of the status that SNL achieved by the time we get to late 80s, and that's no coincidence, around the same time Seinfeld has his show,
Right.
where it's a show about just everyday stuff,
Show about nothing, yeah.
like,
But again, looking at it from a different perspective.
right, and
yeah.
just like saying, now, you know, it's like we've created this kind of comedian, and, you know, Conan definitely had a role with that, of like, and he did it all the time on his show, where he would just go out, you know, his best stuff was when he would go out to the, you know, whether it just be down the block from, you know, Rockefeller Center, and interact with people, and just his
Yeah.
remotes were always so wonderful, because that is reality. He wasn't doing a parody, he wasn't doing a skit, he was like immersing himself,
Sure.
and just, you know, improvising as he goes. And so it's like, had SNL crashed and burned, if it didn't develop into what Lorne Michaels got it to be, it wouldn't have achieved that status, and it also wouldn't have created that kind of humor. You know,
Right.
that like every week we get a little like mirror put up, basically. You know, every Saturday, here's what we've been up to for the last week,
Yeah.
and here's a funny take on it.
Yeah.
And they mastered it in that era. That was the end of part 1 of my conversation with Tony about Saturday Night Live. Part 2 will come out next week. But if you want to hear it early, head on over to Substack or Patreon.com and search for the Everything is Primary Source podcast.